Welcome back to the Biblical Justice Resources podcast. Sometimes you have plans for an episode, sometimes life comes in and changes those plans, and sometimes the change offers the opportunity to antagonize even more people. Let me explain. Our conversation today was going to primarily focus on a concept called white followership, which is essentially helping white people learn how to decenter their whiteness and learn to be followers, especially in multiracial contexts. Potentially contentious for a certain group of people in its own right. But since today's guest and I are both local to Minneapolis, and since we recorded in the midst of ICE and DHS being in our city, it felt necessary to take some time and discuss what's been happening on the ground. Add contentious topic number 2. If you're interested in hearing more about these topics, then stick around for our conversation with today's guest, Reverend Dr. Rose Lee Norman. Pastor Rose is executive pastor at Sanctuary Covenant Church in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where she has served since 2010. She also has served as adjunct professor in reconciliation studies at Bethel University in St. Paul, Minnesota, and North Park Theological Seminary in Chicago, Illinois. She was also the recipient of the 2022 ECC Women in Leadership She Preaches Award for Excellence in Biblical Preaching. As mentioned, our conversation starts with what we've seen in Minneapolis up until the point of our recording on January 13th. We then move into the concept of white followership, what it is, why it's important to decenter whiteness, and how this applies to understanding the gospel. Now, if you will, join me for this conversation with Reverend Dr. Rose Lee Norman. My name's Eric, and this is the Biblical Justice Resources podcast. Our conversation will begin right after this. The Biblical Justice Resources podcast is supported by listeners like you at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and helping to resource individuals and the church for the pursuit of biblical justice, please consider giving today at patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources. Again, visit patreon.com/biblicaljusticeresources to help support the podcast. Now on with the show. Pastor Rose, thank you for joining me here today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Eric.
So, like I just mentioned to you, we have 2 people here from Minneapolis as everything is currently happening in Minneapolis. We're recording on days of today, Tuesday the 13th. So about a week before this episode will drop. And so who knows what will happen in the coming week, but just sort of how have things been, and how are you responding as a pastor, and how is the church responding?
Yeah, great question. Well, I'm grateful that you've named it as well, because it's definitely a daily reality for all of us. Some of us, of course, feel it differently, but it feels chaotic. In all honesty, it feels really chaotic. It feels, I know a lot of us who living in Minneapolis who lived, during 2020. It feels akin to everything that happened post George Floyd with the uprisings. And so it definitely feels chaotic right now and unknown, because we just don't know. I mean, we're hearing that there's more ICE agents who are coming to Minnesota, specifically the Twin Cities. And really, it sounds like there's no plan for them to let up yet. And so that feels really unknown and uncertain, and it does feel like each day the pressure is mounting, definitely. And so it feels a little bit overwhelming. However, I mean, I'm grateful that we've not grateful for the situations, but grateful for the experience of going through difficult times in the past in our city, and seeing just the strong community that we have here within our city. People are not letting up in terms of their protesting and speaking out against this injustice. And so I'm grateful that we're seeing that there's pushback, because there should be, for sure. This is not just unjust. It's inhumane what's happening. And so I'm grateful that we have a city that's responding. In terms of how we're responding as a church, as pastors, I mean, certainly I know that some people want to see more, but certainly a first response is always prayer. And we believe strongly that there's power in prayer. But we also pray with our words and with our feet. And so I've seen so many people showing up to support the efforts that we have to support our immigrant community here within our church community in our pantry that we have. So I'm seeing just incredible response from people. So encouraging people to help their neighbors in this time. So I'm grateful for both the opportunity to have a spiritual community where we can pray, where we can pause together and support each other through this, and tangible ways that we can respond as well to meet real needs in our community.
Yeah. And the day that the shooting happened last Wednesday, as we're recording, Sanctuary already had, or church already had a prayer gathering scheduled. And that night I was like, it does not feel good to be alone right now. Need to be somewhere else where that is happening. So
Absolutely.
I was glad that was already prepared. And then the night was kind of shifted a little bit because of the actions of the day.
Yep, absolutely. And one of our pastors, Pastor Jennifer, who was leading that time, during the day right away, she sent us a message to the pastors and said, I'm scrapping what I originally had, and we're going in a different direction to respond to what's happening in our city.
Yeah.
So I'm grateful for the agility of our staff, of our pastors, in our community.
Yeah. So I'm kind of curious. The thought came to mind as we're going to kind of shift away from current events to a different sort of topic, more that you've done academic study in. I'm curious from the perspective of like preparing the congregation. It seems to me we've had a year, I don't think anyone anticipated things looking the way they currently do, but we have had a year of knowing that there was going to be more enforcement in some sort of way. And so I'm curious, there is a like philosophical, how do we respond as Christians sort of way that I think will lead us into the rest of the conversation. But then there is also the practical, what has happened to like prepare staff, prepare what has been happening. And I'm hopeful that a response to that sort of question will be helpful to people around the country, because this is not just happening in Minneapolis. So what has been happening in like terms of a practical, how do we respond if ICE shows up, if people in our congregation are affected, what does that look like?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, as soon as, Trump was elected as president, we knew that we had to have policies and procedures in order in case there was escalation, and especially to protect our immigrant neighbors. And so, one practical response that we had right away is we developed an ICE protocol and had talked through with other churches, our denomination, lawyers, other community engagement leaders and such. What do we do in this situation? What are our rights? How do we protect immigrants who are coming as guests into the pantry, but also serving in the pantry? And then also on Sundays, what do we do if ICE shows up at our door? And so, yeah, we did take concerted time to develop what those protocols would look like. And so actually, last Sunday during our church service, our church is located right across the street from a grocery store, a large grocery store. And ICE was there, and there was quite a swelling of people. People were honking their horns and trying to persuade ICE to leave. But I was called out of the service to respond. And I'm grateful that we had a protocol, an action plan in place. And I was grateful to not only have like a plan that for us to follow, but we had reviewed it with our security teams, our staff team, volunteer teams, and even members of our congregation who, were not serving on that Sunday. We gathered together and we devised a plan of like, here's what we're going to do if they come next door to our site. And so we were able to pause and just pray together to ensure our students were safe, and to alert the congregation in a calm way, to let them know that ICE was, across the street, and to, if they needed to be escorted, to alert staff and our hospitality and security teams to ensure that everyone got there safely. So I'm grateful that we had that in place already. Other ways that kind of preparation, I think there's a spiritual preparation too. You will often hear, so I serve at Sanctuary Covenant Church in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and you will often hear in sermons ways in which we are trying to spiritually equip our congregation to deal with what is not a sprint, but a marathon in the work of justice, and especially in this moment. And so I think it's multifaceted, but there's certainly practical ways, and just being mindful of, we're grateful that there's so many congregants who are ready and willing to respond at a moment's notice. And so connecting with those members to respond when we need it. Yeah.
Yeah. And as I'm listening to that response and trying to figure out how to take us into the next place, I feel like I need to say that I feel incapable of knowing how to respond right now, and that I'm sad that I have any feeling that I should feel capable. Like, it doesn't feel like these are things that should be happening.
Right.
But on pushing more towards that philosophical, theological preparation, you named already that this has happened in Minneapolis. This happened 5 years ago with responses after George Floyd was killed. As much as I don't want this to just be about what's happening now, it's happening now, and I'm curious what you pulled, what the church pulled from that experience that is kind of informing how to respond now, not just as the church, but as you're walking alongside the congregation, theologically, pastorally. How did responses then translate to how you're thinking about things now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think some of the learnings that we had from, maybe not so much learnings, yes, learnings, but also just our posture of how we approach situations within our community. Pastor Edrin, our lead pastor, will often say that in times of crisis, in times of need, we don't run away, but we run toward. And so I think that there's already a natural posture within our church community to move toward those who are, are feeling the greatest burden of injustice. And so I think already written into the DNA of our church is that moving toward. And so I think that allows us to consider in more, I guess, almost like more agile ways of how we respond, because we don't have to start by convincing people that they should respond or convincing them that this is part of the call of Christ. That foundation is laid. That's a part of who we are as a church. And I think that's important to name, because it's not always the reality in every church, especially in white churches, to name it more specifically. And so I think what we've learned is that you can't underestimate being a good neighbor. Like that, I think we want to have these incredible strategies and policies, and those are all good things. But when it comes down to it, the greatest impact is simply being a good neighbor. And we saw that coming out of 2020 after George Floyd. In, the first day or two, it wasn't new in terms of, another Black man harmed by police. But the swell that happened, making Minneapolis this epicenter of injustice, in that moment was not what anyone was expecting, especially during the pandemic, all of that. And so I don't think any of us knew what it was truly going to become. But even in the, immediate days following, the first thing we decided to do was, well, the only thing we can do and we know how to do is let's bring out the grills, let's feed people, let's just let people know we're here, that we're not leaving, we're not retreating, we're not afraid, and we are here to be a good neighbor. And so I think we've learned that. And so I think that's easily translatable in the moment right now, is that we can be a good neighbor. It may seem small in some ways, but simply being here with our pantry open, shelves are stocked, providing and offering, very tangible needs for people, I think is something that we always strive, or that we strive to do, and that we learned from 2020. I think also kind of a learning from George Floyd, and then now is that, our community knows what we need. And I say that because in 2020, we had just a swell of responses from white suburban churches, which was wonderful, but often providing things we weren't necessarily asking for or needing. And that created tension because, as you probably know, but for your listeners, our church became a site as basically a distribution center overnight. Many of the grocery stores were damaged and not in operation. All of public transportation was down. We already live in a food desert in this community, and so there were many, many needs. And without, naming too many names, but some churches were responding in goodwill for sure, but put us in a position where, okay, we have all of this stuff now, like, what do we do with it? And it became something so much bigger than what we ever thought. And so we had, food distributions for days, for weeks during that time, and it absolutely met a need, but it was not something that we asked to become. And so that was tricky to navigate that. And again, it was a blessing because it was absolutely serving a need. But it was difficult to manage, especially in the aftermath, and especially for our staff team. It put a lot of constraints on them. And we had a lot of white churches coming in to volunteer, which again was a blessing, but we had to navigate a lot of their, help them understand what it means to serve in our community, not to make certain assumptions, and not to deteriorate the reputation that we've tried to build here in our community. And so it was multi-layered, it's very complex, but we certainly learned that, we know what we need within our community. So those are a few, I guess, kind of correlating lessons I think that can be applied today.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to lead into our more philosophical conversation.
Right.
I meant
Yes.
to look up the title of your dissertation before, multiple times today before we did this, and I didn't.
That's okay.
But essentially, the idea is around white followership, I think is how you would phrase it.
Mhm.
And what comes to mind to me, I have a friend named Michelle Warren who works out in Denver, lives out in Denver, very involved in advocacy and activism and things like that. And she wrote in one of her books about the experience of 2020, about this group of largely white people who were coming into this for the first time, but
Yes.
didn't know how to protest actually. So they're pushing past the people who have been doing this for a long time to try and get to the front to voice their thing.
Yeah.
Totally understandable, but not really the way that they could best be serving what is happening at the time.
Exactly.
That just seems like one example of this
Mhm.
idea of white followership. So I wonder if you could kind of define how you understand that term.
Yeah, well, I think the need for white followership is exactly what you're saying, that there's a gap of experience and understanding on the part of white people. And it's good that they're a part of that movement, good that they're becoming aware, but there is a long legacy that they can join and learn from instead of, centering themselves yet again. And so white followership, so I serve at Sanctuary Covenant Church, which is an urban multi-ethnic church. And we are our kind of flavor as a church is we're a Black-led, Black-centered multi-ethnic church. And so and we're planted in the epicenter of the African American community in Minneapolis. And so all of that matters to the context and the people and the ethos of who we are at Sanctuary. And so when I, it was always a goal and a hope of mine to work on my doctorate. And when I found the program at Boston University, the topic of the program was transformational leadership. How can you be an agent of change in your religious community, whatever that looks like? And as a white woman in a multi-ethnic church that is Black-led and Black-centered, the question that I'm continually asking myself is, what is my role in our church? And what does it mean for me in my discipleship journey and then discipling others, especially white Christians, to not get in the way of our mission as an urban multi-ethnic church? And so, in so many of my doctoral classes, the questions were on leadership. How are you leading through, this change that you want to see? What's the gap? Where do you want to fill that gap? And what does that look like? And for me, I found the research of Dr. Corey Little Edwards. She's a sociologist, and she writes on and studies multi-ethnic churches. And as a staff team, we read her book, The Elusive Dream. And it's a study on a particular multi-ethnic church. And through her research, she sought out and thought that she would learn and glean from this church what they're almost like a secret sauce. Like, how do you make multi-ethnic churches work? What's their secret sauce? How do they disrupt injustice? What does it look like to dismantle prejudice within a diverse church setting? And what she found was that actually these very churches who set out to dismantle prejudices and racism actually perpetuate them. And so that was eye-opening for me when I read it, like probably 12 years ago. And it became something that, I really wanted to understand more. And I really wanted, in some ways, like Sanctuary to be different. How can we not perpetuate this pattern of multi-ethnic churches? And is there something different because we are Black-led and Black-centered that we can disrupt this more? And so that led me into, this program on transformational leadership. And we were talking, and I could name so much of what I was feeling and sensing within our church, but I couldn't really particularize what I wanted to study, what gap I wanted to fill. And it was in one of our sessions where one of our professors was talking about leadership, but then also the role of followership. And a light just, went off, and I was like, that's it. White followership. It's how do we help white people understand both their role and their relationship to the mission of decentering themselves and centering a different expression of leadership. And so I played around a lot with what a definition would be for white followership, and I don't know that I'm there, but I guess I would say that white followership is both a role and a a role in a relationship that white people can embody as a way to decenter their own power and normativity while centering a different expression, cultural expression of leadership, especially in a church. And so for me, it's white followership is defining, for white people what their, I don't want to say place in like a derogatory way, but like an empowering way, that this is a way that we can work toward this mission and this vision that we have, in a way that doesn't distract, I guess, in a lot of ways from what our mission and vision is, and allows for other expressions of leadership to flourish.
Yeah. And I think that's important to name that last point because there is a space.
Yeah,
It is
definitely.
just, I guess, like so many other things, you need to learn how to be in the space.
Right. Yep.
I, you're mentioning Corey Little Edwards brought up a quote that I had pulled.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, yeah, so I
Yeah.
don't actually have it in quotes. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
this was potentially
Yeah.
paraphrased, but
Mm-hmm.
interracial churches remain racially integrated to the extent that they are first comfortable places for whites to attend, which
Mm-hmm.
is like is there's so many different emotions that are attached to that statement
Right.
because like I feel I guess we'll project a little bit onto people who are joining multiracial churches, but they're trying not to be that, but it's still the person that they are coming as.
Mm-hmm.
How, I mean, Sanctuary now has been around for over 20 years
Mm-hmm.
and has been intentionally multi ethnic, multiracial the entire time while having that Black centered sort of vision.
Mm-hmm.
From your experience, I guess, what does it look like as new white people join the congregation or come to the congregation? And even, I guess, from conversations in the past with other folks there, it seems like there was a big swell in
Mm-hmm.
2020.
It
So,
was.
I guess, what's the experience there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I can only share what I've noticed, and that is, I do think that I feel strongly that a lot of white folks who are coming to Sanctuary really have good intentions for being there. There's been some sort of tension that's been brought up in their life, in their experience, their theological understanding, and they're, often feeling like this homogenous white church that I've been a part of is not addressing, these issues of injustice that are happening in the world. I need to find a space where that is a part of the theological and spiritual formation of their faith experience. So I'm always very grateful that people have the courage to say, I'm feeling such a disconnect and such a tension that I want to seek out something different. So I think there's something really admirable about that, for sure. And I think without judgment, there's also a reality that for us as white people, we live in a world of white normativity. Sometimes it's hard to even know what that means until we see something very different. And so, even coming into, a more diverse space, we bring all of that, normativity and almost, cultural baggage in a lot of ways, with us. We don't check our privilege at the door. We don't check our power at the door, even though we hear from a pastor who is a different ethnicity or race than us. And so I think it's important to name that we still carry that privilege and that normativity within us into those spaces, and we have to be aware of that. And I think one that, often people who meet with me and who are newer and they want to be here at Sanctuary, they want to be a part of our church, they want to um, join in the mission at Sanctuary. And they'll often ask, like, what advice do you have for me? And one of the things I talk about a lot is discomfort. that discomfort is a part of the experience. Like you cannot be a white person at sanctuary and not expect to feel uncomfortable. And if that's your barometer of comfort, you won't last very long at sanctuary. That's just the reality. And I share a lot in white followership because I share basically like a discipleship pathway for white people. In one of the kind of tenets or characteristics we talk about is staying power, that discomfort is a part of it, and staying through the discomfort is part of the commitment, and getting acquainted with discomfort, because that means whiteness is no longer centered. And so that's actually a good thing that you're feeling some of that disconnect, or that discomfort, I should say, discomfort. And so Dr. Corey Edwards, as she talks about, how interracial churches remain integrated only to extent that, that white people first are comfortable in them, what she's sharing is really the conditions or the limitations of diversity in those churches. And so we have to name that white comfort is real and that it's not innocent. And what I mean by that is if we state that like comfort is the standard, then again, it's always going to be difficult. And you can't expect that that's not going to happen. And I think when we label, I guess, discomfort as like a barometer, as we create discomfort as a barometer for us, then we'll never experience a different way of thinking or being, because we'll automatically label it as bad or as wrong. And discomfort's a really bad barometer for us. It also can be mistaken then as a verdict. This must be wrong. It must be unbiblical. This is surely divisive. But instead, it's simply actually just information. Like, this is new to me. This is unfamiliar. This is challenging me in some way. It's more neutral than you might think. And so I think an overabundance of white comfort, what it does is it really entrenches preferences. And that's where it gets really sticky, because that's where power can be centered when white preferences are like the standard. And so as Christians, we're called in God's kingdom, which is inherently and supposed to be by design diverse. We can't baptize preference into a principle. That comfort can't be the yardstick for measuring orthodoxy. And discomfort will bring up many triggers, especially of retreat. But instead, it should be one that should trigger curiosity. And so I think that staying power can be really hard at times, but when you can push through that and see how curiosity and a different expression, it's incredible the ways, and I'm sure you experienced this too, Eric, how deep your faith grows in new ways because it's opened up to the broader kingdom.
Yeah, that's I mean, there's so many different conversations we've had just on the podcast that intersect with that response. I want to come back to white preferences. So if I forget, which is entirely possible in the next minute, that's where I want to go. But I have a story I want to recount before that, a story I want to tell. So I had Greg Coles on the podcast. I don't know if you know that name.
Yes.
Last year. Yep. And in doing prep for that, I read his book, No Longer Strangers. And he recounts a story. He primarily grew up as a missionary kid in Indonesia and then went to college at a school in upstate New York. And he recounted people who would ask him, do you ever wish you grew up a more normal experience? And when I read it, I don't remember experiencing it the first time I read the book, but when I read it again, I was like, what's normal?
What's normal? Right. Exactly.
Like, I have not been working primarily a 9 to 5 sort of job for a little period of time here. And I will go to the store at a time where 9 to 5 people will be at work, and there are
Mhm.
a lot of people at the store. So it's
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
there are a lot of people not doing what I grew up considering to be normal, but
Right.
it is still an existence that is in the world.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think to this, there's not a value judgment there on that sort of an experience. But coming
But
back,
because, well,
oh,
I'll
go
say,
ahead.
but because of white normativity, we
Right.
do place a judgment on that. And not only a judgment, but a whole hierarchy of it. And so that's a danger of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But to the point of white preference, I want to tie this into how we think about this theologically, I think. So when I was in seminary, I had 2 theology classes, and you had to write a synopsis paper for each of them. You take 3 theologians and you say, here's like the first class is a lot more of the like foundational
Mm.
theological things. Here's
Yeah.
what each of these 3 people say, here's how they agree, here's how they disagree, here's what I think for 6 different topics. And then again, 6
Mm.
more sort of in the weeds topics the second semester. But you would have like 2 approved, like you had this approved list of
Mhm.
theologians in their books, and you go through, you pick 2 of them, and then you have a list of
Mhm.
essentially global theologians, non-white theologians. Pick a
Right.
person off of here and then tie that in.
Yeah.
I like totally value being able to say we need to have like understand where theological points are coming from a diversity of perspectives, but even just the way that's framed ends up being like,
Yep.
here's the right way. And here I had a friend who like felt like he had this conversation with his professors, like here's the
Mhm.
right way of things and here is this other sort of off on the side thing.
Right. Yep.
So that, I think we've had conversations here about like the stick to the gospel quote unquote idea
Yeah.
and what is actually included in the gospel. how
Mhm.
does how do you see white preferences affecting how white Christians think about what is
Mhm.
the gospel and what is included in the gospel and what churches
Mhm.
should be concerned about addressing?
Oh, yes. Yes, that's a great question. Well, first, I think it's helpful to name and even maybe define some things.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm all for that's what this whole thing's about.
yes, yes, yes. And I will say right off the bat, I'm not an expert. I don't have all the answers. I'm still in process. This is a lifelong journey for me. And I get a little wary sometimes when we're like having hard and fast definitions because I think things do, change and there's better ways to explain things and whatnot. And even just like the lexicon changes. And even what I've seen in the last 20 years in social justice, like it's changed a lot. But I think it is important to name just like what white supremacy is and what white normativity is, to understand some of that. So white supremacy, I see it as it's an ideology and it's a system that has this assumption at its root that white people are superior and that because of that, they should be dominant. And it influences so many different factors, right? From politics, economics, culture, religion. And its purpose is really to maintain power and advantage over people of color. So I think it's important to name what that like system and ideology is, because a byproduct of white supremacy is white normativity, which is, I would say it's like a cultural pattern where white experiences, where, our values, speech, appearance, all, different ways of being are treated as the default, as the norm, and everything else is marked as different. And so I think it's important to name some of that there's like this standard setting and like who sets the baseline and who sets what's like, and even in, Christianity, who sets, what does orthodox mean? And so I think it's important to name some of that, within this conversation. But yeah, I think it's very I also in seminary had that same experience, in systematic theology. It's very similar assignment where we had to, look at a few different European theologians and what they thought about it. And you could read a book on the supplemental reading list, of authors of color and women. And I think that's really dangerous um, because it gives us a very narrow perspective about, what the kingdom of God and what our mission is as God's people. And so I think there's something really dangerous about doing that. But it's also not necessarily surprising because that is the perpetuation of white normativity within theological education. Um, but I think what we miss out on when we do that is we perpetuate a hierarchy within our theological interpretations. But it does again deem like any sort of expression or theological approach or interpretation of the Bible as other or different, or even, it's supplemental or optional instead of being required in terms of how we understand God, the church, and our mission, because it is absolutely it's not up to one group to decide, and it's based on the fact that, we believe that every person is made in the image of God. um, that right there means that we need all voices to understand theological interpretation and such. And if we really look at the Bible, I mean, God has a particular preference for those who are on the margins. And so I don't know if you've had Dr. Dennis Edwards on the
Yep.
podcast. Yeah, okay. I mean, he has a wonderful book, Might from the Margins, and makes that exact claim that we look so often to those who are in power for the way of Jesus, when instead it's those who have experienced a similar experience to him of marginalization that we should be looking toward.
Yeah, I wonder if we can talk about power because that was one of the things I pulled out of
Mhm.
the part of your dissertation I was able to get through. Uh, I just had a question that I sent over to you: is how are we defining power? And I think maybe more maybe apropos to what's happening right now,
Mhm.
like we understand God as being all powerful.
Mhm.
Is there some way in which we are trying, like, I guess humanity is trying to take that on? That's the story of
Yeah,
humanity since the beginning of time.
right.
But
Mhm.
why this feels like a ridiculous question when I know the answer is like money and whatnot. But like, why are people seeking power here? Like,
Yeah.
why? Maybe this
Mhm.
isn't a question you even need to answer. Maybe it's just a question we need to have
Yeah.
sit with for a while. But what? So let's come to something coherent as I'm trying to talk myself through
No,
this.
you're fine. You're fine.
How? What is the power then that this? We'll see if this question works. What
Yeah.
is the power that we see people trying to align themselves with, and what is the power we actually need to be aligning ourselves with? I think bringing up Pastor Dennis's book Might from the Margins,
Yeah.
like you see that there is power, might on the
Yeah.
margins.
Right. There is. Yeah.
What is this sort of interplay between how a group of people is understanding power and what we actually need to be looking
Mm.
at as where a more appropriate way of aligning ourselves?
Yeah. I have a few thoughts. I mean, first, I think of the difference between power with and power over. Power with is communal. There's a sense that we have influence and we can leverage that together in helpful, good ways. But I think power over is what we so often see, especially within white supremacy, of this institutional cultural dominance over to define norms, to define who gets credibility and who doesn't, who belongs and who doesn't, to preserve this white advantage in a lot of ways, and then to penalize those who either, don't match it or, line up with it, or those who resist it. And so I think power over is about protecting comfort and preserving control. And I don't think that's the kind of power, obviously, we're uh, called to, and certainly is sinful. But I think there is a power with that, especially, from the Holy Spirit, we're given power and authority, but the source and the center of that is God and not us. It's not humans. And so I see it a differentiation in that sort of sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it does. Yeah. And I think it ties directly into Pastor Dennis. So folks can find a link to that episode in the show notes, along with a bunch of other stuff that we've talked about.
Yeah.
We still have a little bit of time left, so we're not like imminently at the end, but I do want to have time to think about another space that you've taught in, because
Mhm.
you are pastoring in a multiracial, multi-ethnic church, but you've also taught at a local college institution that is much less diverse than Sanctuary is,
Yeah.
and is one that I also have experience with. We were there at different times, but
Mhm.
I'm curious how you go about these lessons or this teaching differently in that context singular, whether that be it's a much more much wider one
Mhm.
sort of culture place, whether it's like a very specific demographic age demographic group,
Mhm.
whether it's difference between pastoral walking alongside and teaching walking alongside. What are some of the
Mhm.
differences in the way you approach that in that context?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say a major difference, being at Sanctuary, it's an expectation to speak to call out, and to lead through a lens of, justice and reconciliation, because that's who we are, that's our mission. And so there's a difference because there's that expectation. Where I would say at the university where I taught, it it wasn't an expectation. It wasn't even necessarily always welcomed. I was an adjunct professor, and so I kind of flew under the radar, probably a little bit more than other professors. But in all honesty, when I taught there, it certainly was very homogenous. It was largely white students in my classes. There'd be a few students of color. Um, and most of my classes, they were required for a particular degree. And so there was some baseline of interest in the conversation of justice and reconciliation as it relates to our faith. But there was one class in particular I taught that was an elective. And so there were very few majors of that program in that class, and that was a big difference, a very big difference. But I would say a big difference from Sanctuary to that university was, um, I saw myself in those students. I myself grew up in a small town, homogenous, largely white community. I certainly grew up with, white norms and white culture, and I was discipled. And I grew up in the Catholic Church, but it was white. And so I was shaped and formed, my worldview was shaped in that reality. And so by the grace of God, I had this like deep inkling, deep desire from the Holy Spirit to widen that worldview. I had no idea what that would mean and look like, but it eventually brought me to Ecuador and South America, to Chicago, to Los Angeles. And through those experiences, I mean, the Holy Spirit opened my eyes to not only a bigger world than just my own experience, but also theologically, it just opened my faith in such a different way. And so through that experience, um, I had my own kind of reckoning of what it means to unlearn and relearn in this call to justice. And so with those students, I really saw myself in them. And so, yes, there's a very different starting point in those classes and conversations than at Sanctuary. But I appreciated the opportunity to walk alongside them in their own awakening journey and helping them see just the how much better it it is to be discipled in a wider, more diverse environment than an all white one. And yeah, so it was, again, I really saw myself in the students, and that was a gift to be able to walk alongside them. It doesn't mean that it was always easy. There were definitely students who were very antagonistic, to be honest, about, the topics that we were talking about. And I'll often sometimes, wondered, why are you taking this class? Like, you don't have to. There's other classes you could take. But at the end of the day, my hope is that in their experience from that class, like I had mentors who did for me, would do for them, and to help them see a wider, different perspective on the kingdom of God.
Yeah, I was curious about that as you're talking, just that the program itself is one that, and the classes that go along with it, is something that you would have to opt into. Like,
Yeah.
it's not just
Right.
everyone at the school is not going through the
Mhm.
classes that you're teaching
Yep.
necessarily.
Right.
And that was something I experienced too, like as I was starting to learn things while I was in school, is like,
Mhm.
oh, people around me don't have the same
Mhm.
concerns that I do right now. They're not asking the same questions I am.
Yep.
And I don't necessarily have the like an exact knowledge of who is listening to this podcast, like the
Mhm.
demographically,
Yeah.
but it in some ways is for the person who has opted into this journey of pursuing justice and maybe is not in a context where that is everyone around them. So I
Right.
wonder what, like, we have this idea of white followership. What does it look like
Mhm.
as a white person to try and either lead or interact with other white people who
Mhm.
are not in this place? How do we engage with that group of people?
Yeah, that's a great question. In my research on white followership, one of the things that I found is that actually a great success marker is to be in affinity groups with other white people. That's really vital and necessary. And so even if a person is in, predominantly white context and church, that does not mean that you can't be, a vital part, or I guess it doesn't have to create such a huge dissonance. You don't have to move or like go to another church necessarily, to be formed and shaped in some powerful ways, and to contribute to the work of justice and reconciliation as a Christian. And and so I think some tangible ways are certainly to find other white people who are on this journey and who want to have the hard conversations, because I think that's incredibly important. Within our denomination, we have an anti-racism discipleship pathway, and it's a three-part process or three-part journey. And the first journey in that pathway is affinity groups, because there's something that's really necessary um, in throughout, your experience, but certainly as you start the journey of awareness, to be with other white people, to have those hard conversations, because I think it provides a space, to have those conversations of similar experience. Like, I'm experiencing this dissonance or this tension with my family, or my church doesn't seem to be responding in these ways. Like, that's a pretty common experience for a lot of white people. And so having that space for for white people to talk together is really important. And also it creates a space where to hold each other accountable as well. I found that to be really helpful for myself. There's a few close friends that I have from college, other white women that, during certain times in our adult lives that we've continued to stay in contact and support each other when, we're trying to respond in the ways that we want to be, faithful and responsive. And so I think that's a really helpful space. And also to share, like, I'm really trying to grow in this area. Will you hold me accountable to that? Especially, as we talked about comfort and discomfort, having an affinity group to help you and support you through that is helpful. So I think there's a lot of benefits to having spaces where you can connect with other white people. Certainly other advice for those who are starting this journey, I would say, read authors from different backgrounds from yourself, especially if you've been discipled in an all white or predominantly white church setting. It's really important to read other perspectives and interpretations of our faith through diverse perspectives. I think that's really important. But I don't think it means to be, I guess I should say, to contribute to, this work of justice doesn't require you to be in a multi-ethnic space, because I think every church has a call to be justice-minded, and that's going to look different in every community, but it's certainly the work of every church as an extension of Jesus to be part of, whatever justice issues are pertinent to their context.
Yeah. And I think that leads into the last question I have for you here is just, what are some of those resources? I can't get away from it with the Biblical Justice Resources podcast there, but not just like hard resources to read or whatever, but like what are ways to, if you're not finding people to engage with, like in some ways, I wish there was a way I could have a page on the website that is like, here's the people in your city you should talk to, which is probably not a practical possibility, but what are resources that people could engage with to start off on this journey or kind of continue on, or ways to kind of find like-minded people around them?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, there definitely are resources out there, and there's a lot. I think, well, I know at one point, I believe it's through Tasha Morrison's, it was Be the Bridge. And she had different sites in different cities where they had different either book clubs or other spaces for people to connect and to gather. I don't know if those are still in existence, but I knew a lot of people coming out of 2020 and George Floyd. There were a lot of white folks that I knew that were joining those groups, and those were really helpful spaces. So I think that would be a really tangible one. Man, I mean, there's so many books that I think of right away. Sanctuary, we used to have a resource list, and so maybe I can give that to you and you can share that. Yeah, I'll look and see if we have that. I really appreciate there's a new commentary. It's right here, the New Testament in color. That's a great resource if you're wanting to have a different perspective.
See it on the screen. It's on my shelf back here.
Ah, yes.
Where
awesome.
Is it? There, right there.
Okay.
That one.
Okay.
Right there, yep.
Which Pastor Dennis Edwards from North Park University Theological Seminary, he has a contribution in here as well. But this is a great resource for people to use and to start on that journey. So yeah, there's just so many. There's definitely an overabundance, but
Well, with that, thank you, Pastor Rose, for joining me here. I really enjoyed having that conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. I really enjoyed it as well.
Thank you for listening to the Biblical Justice Resources podcast. This podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Eric Beck. To learn more about how you can be resourced for the pursuit of biblical justice, visit our website at biblicaljusticeresources.com.